So what we are going to do today is talk about, and I'm just going to change the slide to the agenda here real quick. So for those of you, I don't know if you remember, but basically back in, when was it? 2014. We had a public meeting in this room with several users, and many of you may have come to that meeting. I see some head nods here. So this has been a process that we've been working through. It started in 1995. We published a groundwater, there was a USGS groundwater report that was published. And then in November of 95, we established what was called the Utah Goshen Valley Groundwater plan, and we adopted that plan back in 95. So then we've done some studies since then in cooperation, in partnership with the Utah Geological Survey, and they did a first stage of that report and finished it in 2014, and we came and presented those results, or they did, with us, and they have finished the second part of that study, a continuation of that study. And so they are here again, that we wanted to bring that information back to the community and share that information with you. But also let me introduce some of the staff that is here with me that you guys will probably get to know over the next few months. But let me introduce Blake Bingham. He's actually standing in the back, and he is my he's the sign-up list monitor. No, he is actually one of my deputy state engineers. We also have Eric Jones, who many of you might know. He is an assistant state engineer in our applications records. Previously, he served as our Utah Lake Jordan River regional engineer, so you may have dealt with them. Our current regional engineer is Chase McDonald, and you are going to hear from him today as well. You'll get to know him if you have questions about this area or your water rights. Chase and his team are a wealth of knowledge that can help you. We also have Jacob Wright with him, and Jacob is going to be probably working with several of you over the next few months as we collect some additional data. And then we also have two of our folks from our technical services, Jim Reese, who's a assistant state engineer, and David Jones, who is the brains of the operation. So anyway, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the time over to Chase, and then he's going to explain what the current policy is and what we believe are, actually, Stefan is going first. Sorry, I got the order reversed here. So Stefan Kirby with the Utah Geological Survey will go first, present the results of the study. And then we'll have Chase McDonald get up, and he will talk to you about the current policy, the current information that we have on groundwater pumping, and some steps forward that we will take. And then we'll take some questions at the end, and we'll be here to, even after we conclude the meeting, to take additional questions. So we do have, this is being recorded, and it will be placed on our website. So be aware, when we do questions, we'll actually have you come up to the mic so that it can be heard, and for anyone that's listening online as well. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Stefan.
Okay, so I'm going to present tonight about the hydrogeology and water budget for Goshen Valley here. This was a two-phase study. The earlier phase was on the hydrogeology, sort of the groundwater conditions of the basin. And then the latter stage was to develop a water budget for the basin. It was funded primarily by Division of Water Rights over multiple years. We also have some other funders, Alberta Valley Ag, one of the local canal companies, the Bureau of Reclamation, and then also DEQ. It included a bunch of folks beyond just me. We wrapped up basically the field component of the study back in 2018, and we finally got things through peer review and published in 2022. These results and all the data that we developed as part of the study is available online. That's a link to it, and we can direction you guys to it if you'd like to see it. A little bit of introduction for my part of the talk. There's going to be two parts. There's the first part that's going to be on the hydrogeology, groundwater levels, and then water chemistry. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So there'll be two parts to my discussion tonight. There'll be a first part on the hydrogeology, groundwater levels, and water chemistry, and then there'll be a second part on the water budget that we came up with. I want to start by showing this map on the left-hand side here. One of the things that we were asked to do by Water Rights was to see if there's a way to subdivide the basin in a reasonable way based on the hydrogeology. And we did do that. We subdivided it into 3 basins. I present that here because when we go through our subsequent slides, we'll see that again and again. These 3 sub-basins, each individual basin has unique characteristics that carry through the different data components. And then we also broke out the water budget for each of those different basins individually. Some background on the hydrogeology. It's basically a colored geologic map. The yellow along the valley floor, that's basin fill. It's unconsolidated sands and gravels. That's where most of the wells are completed. You'll see more on wells coming up. The bluish colors, those are carbonate rocks. They're also an important aquifer. That's where some of the most productive wells are completed in those rocks. The reddish colors, those are some of the volcanic rocks, the tinics, and they have varying water yielding characteristics. Sometimes they do yield water to wells, other times they're relatively permeable. It kind of depends on the individual flavor of those volcanic rocks. There's some simplified cross sections that show what these aquifers look like beneath the valley, basically going from west to east. The real important thing with these cross sections is that the principal aquifers here, the basin fill, which is that yellowish color, and then the light blue carbonate rocks, they're basically, they lie right on top of each other, and there's no real discontinuity between the two. That means water can move from one to the other. That's really the important message with that. One of the other things we were asked to do in this particular study was to look at the basin boundary conditions. And basin boundary conditions are dependent on the aquifer characteristics. Okay, do the rocks along a boundary, can water move through them? And then also on the groundwater levels themselves. So do the groundwater levels, could they stimulate flow through a boundary? So basically we colorized the boundary here based on those characteristics. And the important take home from this slide is there's 2 areas where it looks like it's possible based on those constraints for water to move into Goshen Valley in the subsurface, for groundwater to flow into Goshen Valley. One of those is up on the northwest in the Masida Hills. And then there's another area where it's likely that groundwater moves from adjoining basins into Goshen Valley, and that's down on the eastern side there along Long Ridge. Let me see. Yeah, I do. Can you guys see that? No, I'm not sure we have a better, do we have a better pointer than that? Okay. Yeah, that would be great. How do we? Yeah, dim the lights so we can see a little better. Yeah, we need the experts here.
Are you in the presentation room? It's just trying to make it a little bit bigger.
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. There we go.
You want like make it coarser, bigger.
Okay. Thank you. Everyone see? We were waiting on a pointer here. It's the red button?
Okay.
Okay, so let's move back to where we were. So yeah, there's two principal areas where we think water could move into the basin based on these aquifer characteristics, but then also groundwater levels. And one of those is up here by along the Masida Hills. And then another important area where water can move into the basin is down on the eastern part of Goshen Valley here along Long Ridge, kind of the north end of Long Ridge from Current Creek up north. One of the other things we did to define the aquifer system, we collected a bunch of geophysics, gravity in this case. And the point of that is to come up with the thickness of the basin fill, that unconsolidated sands and gravels. So there's only a few wells that penetrate the total thickness of that basin fill. So we use geophysics to tell us about the spatial extent of that particular aquifer system. And the important thing here is that we have a big deep hole, a big area of deep basin fill where it's a few thousand feet thick just to the west of Goshen here. And then elsewhere in a lot of spots, the basin fill's relatively thin, if that makes sense. There's thin sands and gravels overlying those carbonate rocks in a lot of places. This is a summary of looking at well logs and aquifer characteristics based on those well logs. This is taken from all the available drillers logs that are out there. We went through, looked at them all, and we characterized them by the unit that they were completed in. The yellow colors are that unconsolidated sand and gravel aquifer system. The blues are carbonate rocks again. And then the warmer colors are various types of the volcanics, the tertiary volcanics. It's fairly obvious, and you all know this in this room, most of the wells are completed in that basin fill aquifer, okay? A smaller number of wells, but they're very important wells, are completed in the carbonate aquifer system. And then there's a smattering of other wells completed in these other aquifers. Based on information we can get from those well logs, we come up with an estimate of, this should say transmissivity here, but specific capacity. It's basically, it tells us about the well yield in these different aquifer types. And you can see here that the PZ unit, that's our carbonates again. You can see that that's where the biggest wells are. When these numbers get big, those wells make a ton of water. The unconsolidated deposits are over here labeled Q. And again, some of those wells can be very productive, but in general, they're a little less productive. And then these other types, we have fewer examples of them, but they vary in permeability too. These other units also have they have less spatial extent, so they're not as important for the whole basin. This is a recharge type map. So basically this depicts the presence of thick clay layers in that unconsolidated basin fill. And this is important because that controls the setting of the aquifer. Is it confined? So a confined aquifer would have an impermeable, like a cap on it. Those aquifers yield less water, but they also can restrict vertical water movement. That's the other thing that's important out of that. So in Goshen Valley, we really have just this central area, which is basically just to the east of us here, extending over to where it starts to slope up near Genola. That area has these thicker clay layers in the subsurface. And outside of those areas, one of the important outside of that red zone, the clay layers really are, you'll see them in that basin fill, in the sand and gravel basin fill. You'll see clay layers, but they tend to be laterally discontinuous and they're at different elevations. So they don't form a continuous barrier or boundary. This is a start of a look at water levels. So we went out and we made what's called a potentiometric surface. Basically, we went out and measured a bunch of water levels in wells that we could get access to. We also joined that data with measurements that are collected by the USGS. And those numbers allow us to make a contour. And the contour are these little lines here. And those show relative elevations of groundwater, okay, across the basin. And these arrows, I put these in here, those show the direction of groundwater flow based on those contours. So you can see there is a continuous gradient again into our basin, kind of in the Long Ridge area, and then again up here in the Masida Hills. We don't see those continuous gradients into the basin along the southwestern margin of Goshen Valley. Down here, there's things called groundwater mounds, which means you have high elevation groundwater in the mountain blocks that kind of prohibits flow across those boundaries. One other thing to note on here, there's an interesting little bulge in the contour, kind of centered on Current Creek. Okay, that's a place where maybe it looks like there's a little groundwater high that kind of follows Current Creek. And we'll build off that coming up to look at recharge from Current Creek. But it's an important thing to keep in mind. And Utah Lake, yeah, we know that ultimately the groundwater system just grades down to the Utah Lake elevation. This is depth to water. So we take that potentiometric surface and then we just subtract out topography and we get the depth to which you'd need to drill a well to find water, basically is what this is. The important thing here is that across most of Goshen Valley, it's a pretty significant depth to water. Many of you are probably aware of this. Along this western flank here, you know, it's 100 or more feet in a lot of places to groundwater. That is important when we start to think about how groundwater can be consumed by plants, because in those areas where the water table is more than, say, 20 or 30 feet, so everywhere on this map where it's not blue, plants cannot actively consume groundwater, if that makes sense. And that's important for our budget considerations coming up. The corollary, though, is also true. So the areas where it's blue, groundwater is near the surface, and so it can be consumed and discharged by the plant communities or agricultural plants. This here shows what's probably one of the more important points that I'll present here. These are graphs of water level change through time at different spots in the valley, okay? And again, they're colorized here based on these conceptual zones that I've already talked about. You can see that one of the zones, which are these kind of warmer colors, the yellows and reds and browns, there's been a lot of drawdown through time, pretty continuous drawdown since kind of the early 90s, okay, on the order of a foot or two a year. This long-term data, this is from the USGS. This isn't stuff that we've collected. It's data that's publicly available on their website. They collect it yearly. So this southwest part of the valley has and continues to have continuous drawdown of a few feet a year. The zone to the north is zone 1 up here. There's some drawdown. Some of the wells showed drawdown, like this green one here, B. Some of them show little drawdown too. So it's kind of a mix. There's much less drawdown in this northwestern part of the valley. Yeah, so this graph here goes from 1962. I think it's cut off a little bit here, but it should say 2018. And then if you look at the trends between 2018 and now, they're basically consistent. So things haven't really changed, if that makes sense. These trends hold through time. And lastly, the easternmost part of the valley over here, zone 3, really has seen little or no decline. That's a couple of these lines up here that are right along zero. So there's been some change in water level, but it's very negligible compared to other parts of the valley. This is just a map that depicts that water level decline. And we built this off that potentiometric surface, but then also an older potentiometric surface that we had on file from a piece of consultant work back in the 70s. And it shows, you know, these red colors, these are areas where it's declined. The water levels declined greater than 30 or 40 feet over that time period between, say, 2018 and 1975. You can see it's centered out here in this conceptual zone 2, that southwest part of the valley. Again, we see very little decline over here in zone 3 and a little bit of decline up here in zone 1. Yeah, there are a smattering of sites that look like they may have gone up for some reason. Most of those are over here in this zone 3. you know, the changes in water level really record the water budget at that location. So for whatever reason, those particular sites, they're getting a little more recharge than discharge. And then the sites where it's the converse, it's the exact opposite. They're getting more discharge than recharge. Then we'll move into some water chemistry. This was a big part of our work. This was the funding from DEQ helped out a lot with this. We collected a bunch of new samples, mostly groundwater, a smattering of surface water samples though too, so we could help to tie in that stuff. This kind of colorful map over here, this shows different types of water chemistry out here. Most of the waters in Goshen Valley are sodium chloride type waters. The size of the dot, that relates to TDS, total dissolved solids. So the bigger dots, they're higher dissolved solids. Dissolved solids matter primarily when you start to think about drinking water rules. Okay, there's limits on those, generally below 1,000. You can see that across the valley, there's a range of total dissolved solid concentrations, generally centered around 1,000 TDS. We also looked at some of the principal potential contaminants in the groundwater. One of those is nitrate. This is on the left here is a map of nitrate concentrations. You can see a lot of the groundwater is pretty low concentrations. Anything below, say, 5 is pretty low, almost background nitrate concentrations. When you get higher towards 10 or above, there's water quality concerns again in terms of drinking water. That makes sense. Some of these values are quite high. You know, they're over 200 milligrams per liter at one particular site. Those areas seem to correlate with ag interests. That's typical. There's nothing surprising about this. This is typical of basins in western Utah with ag going on. This graph in the lower right-hand corner, we also collected nitrogen isotopes, which are different kinds of nitrogen. And the point of that is it can help you fingerprint how the nitrogen system or nitrate system works. And so the important thing is that it works towards lowering those concentrations out here in Goshen Valley in 2 different ways. One of those is just dilution. So you just have fresher groundwater joining with higher concentrated nitrate groundwater, or denitrification. Denitrification, there's little bugs in the aquifer that'll break down nitrates. So there are processes by which the nitrate concentrations are reduced. This is arsenic. That's another constituent of concern in groundwater. Again, there's drinking water implications here. This story is a little more complicated. We worked with some folks at BYU to help flesh it out. And the story with arsenic out here, the arsenic concentrations seem to be tied primarily to the aquifer material. Does that unconsolidated basin fill have certain types of volcanic debris in it? And then also sort of the chemistry of the aquifer at different places. That can lead to changes in arsenic concentration. So basically, these are all, the arsenic concentrations here are all natural. This isn't a contaminant, it's just kind of the way the system is. Then we'll go into these things. The next few slides are something we call environmental tracers. So these are other things we can measure in the groundwater. And the point of these first couple ones that we'll look at is to think about water age. So water age is basically, we're trying to get some estimate of how long has a given piece of water been in the groundwater system since it was recharged, okay? There's a couple ways to attack this. The first one that we'll look at here is something called tritium. This is a young tracer. It's an isotope of hydrogen that's developed in the upper atmosphere. The nuclear testing made a ton of this stuff, so there was a spike back then that's since degraded. This stuff degrades relatively quickly. So it allows us to trace recent recharge back to about, say, 50 or 60 years. So if you have tritium values bigger than about 0.5 TU, it's a tritium unit, very arbitrary unit, but it fits this tritium work. you have some evidence of recent recharge, okay, in the last 50 or 60 years. When we look on here, big parts of the valley, we don't see any tritium that would tell us there's been any recent recharge. We do see it in a couple places here along the east side of the valley in conceptual zone 3. We also see it from a well near Current Creek. That's an important thing to think about when we think about the ability of Current Creek to recharge water to the aquifer system. And then we see it up here in the mountain block, which we would expect, where there's actually some flowing perennial streams that then kind of infiltrate into the basin fill. This is our old, so we have a young tracer and we have an old tracer, because water can be really old out here in western Utah, really tens of thousands of years old since it recharged. Okay, this is our old tracer. It's percent modern carbon, it's carbon 14. And this, we can get ages out of this, but it's better to think about this fairly qualitatively. Any of these oranges or reds, that water has significant age, maybe up to 10,000 years since it was recharged, if that makes sense. It's been in the system or been traveling through the system for that long. The cooler colors down here, the blues, those are definitely recently recharged. You can get samples of water that we know is recharged in the last, say, 40 years, and it'll have PMC values greater than 50. That makes sense. This mirrors our tritium to a large degree. We see some evidence of recent recharge, but we see a lot of old water in places that show that there hasn't been a lot of recharge. And then we can put both of those together in sort of a binned approach, because there are places where you have a low PMC, so you got at least part of old water, but then you also have tritium, so you got a mix. We know water can mix. So on here, those are shown with yellow. So those are places where they look old based on that carbon 14 value, but then there's a tritium signal in there too. So those are places where you're mixing young recharge with older, further traveled waters. The red on here, those are places where it's just old. There's no evidence of recent recharge via tritium or PMC. You can see that covers big chunks of the valley. This is another environmental isotope technique based on dissolved gases. And it's kind of a complicated technique, but based on the ratio of these gases, you can come up with a temperature at which the water recharged. Okay, that can tell us something important about where the water recharged, right? Because there's areas, say up high in the mountains, we know that groundwater is much colder than water that's out here in the valley, right? So if you have a cold recharge temperature, that would tell you that water is likely recharged maybe in a higher elevation. We see that at a number of spots here in Goshen, particularly over here. There's a couple samples from the warm springs. So they have a recharge temperature that's much less than the current water temperature, and it's a temperature that probably fits with the groundwater system further to the east, near Santaquin Canyon. So then to summarize the hydrogeology and chemistry of the conceptual zones, they tend to break out in light, and we did this on purpose, so they break out with light characteristics. So in zone 1, the principal aquifers are basin fill and carbonates. We know we have that permeable boundary along the Masida Hills, place where groundwater could flow into the basin. We have some water quality issues. We've seen some water level decline up here in zone 1, but not too much. Zone 2, we have our basin fill aquifer again, but we really lack the carbonate aquifer down in zone 2. It's basically basin fill that sits on volcanics of some degree. That's the most common setup. We probably have an impermeable boundary, and that's because of those volcanic rocks, but then also the groundwater mound that could be in these mountain blocks. We also have some water age, both 1 and 2, they have a lot of old water. There's very little evidence of recent recharge. And then this zone 2, we have significant declines in groundwater elevation or groundwater level. Zone 3 over here on the east, again, we have basin fill on carbonates, not unlike Zone 1. We have a big permeable boundary here along Long Ridge and up near Santaquin. We have relatively shallow basin fill. Again, our basin fill map shows us that we have basin fill, but it's only a few hundred feet thick on the carbonates in a lot of places here near the boundary. We also have some young ages for the water over here. That's kind of an important part. So there is there's more active recharge occurring here in Zone 3. And then we have broadly consistent water levels through time over here. And that tells us that the water budget is broadly in balance. See, we've covered a lot of this. The important points here are that based on the hydrogeology and the water levels, it looks like water can move into the basin in a couple spots, Long Ridge and Masada Hills. Most of the groundwater is old in the basin. There's localized areas where it looks like you have recent recharge, but they're localized. And then lastly, the water level decline through time. That's a big deal, and it appears to be largely limited to that southwestern part of the valley, that zone 2 that we call it. And then we'll jump into the water budget part, which builds off that the hydrogeology that I just shared with you. And our initial goal here was to refine that Brooks and Stolp study that Teresa mentioned from 1995. The results of that, I have grade in kind of grayscale here. You can see that even this earlier work they showed for Goshen Valley as a total, they showed more discharge than recharge, okay? And that's, when discharge is greater than recharge, you have a loss of storage in the aquifer system, and that's what leads to groundwater level decline. Our goal here was to refine this budget based on some new measurements of surface water and then our better understanding of the hydrogeology of the area. And a water budget is broadly a balance of recharge. That's things like precip, that subsurface inflow in places where it's possible, infiltration of surface water of different kinds. And we balance that against discharge, which out here is primarily evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is basically plants using water to grow, either ag plants or the natural vegetation. And then well withdrawal. Well withdrawal is a big one. And then, there's a potential for outflow to Utah Lake to a degree as well. So we'll start with the recharge from precip. To make this estimate, we took data from an existing USGS model and technique that's widely used and I think deemed to be pretty functional at this stage. So when you take this model and take the results of the model and follow their methodology, you get a total amount of recharge across the whole valley of just over 8,000 acre feet a year. And then if you parse it out across zones, you can see Zone 2 gets a little more of this recharge from precip, about 4,000, and then lesser amounts in Zone 3 and Zone 1. But it's a pretty small component of the overall water budget. One of our main pieces of work was to try to better constrain surface water. We did that based on things called seepage runs, and I'll show some graphs of that. That's where we measure flow sequentially down a channel, and we see how that measured flow volume changes. That can tell us whether water's entering a stream channel or leaving it. We also did some continuous measurements of flow at 2 sites along Current Creek. Those are down here in blue. These blue dots show those. Those are existing flumes or weirs that you might be aware of, concrete weirs that we took advantage of. The other thing to note on here are the important, and what we've tried to depict are really only the most major canals and ag water conveyance systems. So in yellow up here, we have basically the strawberry or highline water that comes in. Got a nice measurement spot where it comes into the valley at Genola Head. And then down here, we have a series of canals that come from the Warm Springs, one to the north, one to the south. And then down here we have the Alberta Canal, and that's one that we didn't include in our water budget, and that's because during our period of investigation, it really wasn't full. There was one year when it wasn't full at all. There was another year where it was briefly full. That's a potential piece of error that's out there that I want to acknowledge. We don't have good constraints on that. I think within our recent drought times here, it's not commonly full or used. I think that's correct, but it is a potential piece of error that's out there. This graph shows continuous flow at those 2 points on Current Creek. So Upper Current Creek is up in Current Creek Canyon, closer to Mona Reservoir, and then Lower Current Creek is out in Goshen Valley itself. And the important thing here is that we always see this offset between our measured flow between those 2 points. Doesn't matter time of year, ascending flow, descending flow. There's always this offset. So we're losing water between these flumes. Because that happens, we can say that water loss very well could contribute to the groundwater system. And so we use that change in rates and some estimates here to come up with a number of recharge for what Current Creek contributes, okay, when it comes into the basin fill, when it comes into the valley floor here in Goshen. We come up with a value of about 3,400 acre feet a year. Here's graphs of these are seepage runs that I described earlier. So we measure flow here at different points along Current Creek, and we did it both at base flow. This was a really dry year. I think Mona Reservoir was about dry when we did this. Just a little bit of water coming out. These values are in CFS, so less than a single CFS here near Mona. Drops even lower before we get to Erkenbrack. Erkenbrack comes back up. There's some groundwater contribution, and then you can see that the flow rate declines steadily down to Lower Current Creek. So it matches our continuous measurements too. We're losing water into the groundwater system here along this part of the channel. This is at runoff. It's a little more complicated here. A good chunk of this up and down could just be error. It's very safe to assume that our error in these measurements is 10%, maybe even 15% at some of these high water spots. It's just kind of the reality of doing these measurements. But we still have a decline between upper current and lower current. We also looked at the Warm Springs Canal. This is South Warm Springs here. We measured it from one of the main heads and then did a seepage run. Did some seepage stops along it at a couple different times. And you can see we have a similar story. We're losing water down here. In this case, the groundwater system is very near the land surface, very near the elevation of this canal. And then also we have all these wetlands that are basically to the north or east of the canal system. And while we are doing these transects, and I'm sure people are aware of this, there's a lot of water that's coming off this canal system and going out and feeding the different wetland habitats. That's where a lot of the water goes. A smaller portion of that water could enter the groundwater system, but it's not necessarily required. This is North Warm Springs. We did a similar piece of work here. We came up with a total flow of around 4 CFS for North Warm Springs. This water is shunted out onto the wetlands or a few irrigated farms even faster than the water along South Warm Springs. So it's going out there. This surface water is feeding the wetland complex to a large degree. When you put these two, both north and south together, you get a total discharge out of Warm Springs of around 10 to 12, maybe 12 CFS, I think is our preferred number. And we also want to remember that Warm Springs, we talked about some of the chemistry there, seems to fit with the water at Warm Springs likely recharged outside of our basin. Okay, so this is a fair amount of water that's coming into the basin, becoming surface water, but it supports a large degree of this interbasin flow. Here's kind of a wrap up of the surface water measurements. There you can see the Highline Canal number. This is all from data that's publicly available on their website. We just averaged it over the period of our study. And you get a really large value there. You know, it's 13,000 some acre feet a year coming in on the Highline. We also know, this is an important point, we also know that Utah lake water is pumped and used to irrigate in zones 1 and 2. And that's an important point when we think about return flow from irrigation. Because not all irrigation water is obviously consumed by the plant. Some component of that can go back into the groundwater system. But to think about what that volume is, we need to know the total amount of water applied, not just well withdrawal, but also this lake water that's that's being added into the mix. The numbers for that, you know, the constraints on these numbers, these are based on reported values to water rights by these water users. They weren't directly measured, so we're just assuming that the reported values, they're a good fit. I think it's the best thing we have to go on at this stage. Okay, here's some more of these details. I think we've broadly covered these. Lastly, this is kind of an important point I don't think I talked about yet. It appears that little, if any, surface water actually makes it to Utah Lake in most years. And that's based on conversations with folks on the ground, some of whom are in the room, and then also observations of us being out in the field, traipsing around the boundary of Utah Lake to see if there's water going in it. So it looks like the surface water is basically being consumed by either irrigated ag or wetland type vegetation before it gets to Utah Lake. This is our estimate of subsurface inflow that I've been saying is a likely thing throughout this talk. It's described, we basically used it, this is a method called, it's a well-established method, Darcy flux. We use different characteristics of the aquifer and the extent through which water could flow, and then also the water gradient. And that gives us total values of flux through these two zones, one up here in Masida Hills, and then one over on the east on the north end of Long Ridge. These are big numbers, okay? You know, the Masida Hills, we use a calibrated value. It's smaller, it's under 5,000 acre feet, but still not trivial. Over here on Long Ridge, we could have quite a bit of water that's coming in the subsurface, okay? And we kind of picked a middle range between these two end members of what might be possible for interbasin flow. And again, I think we have physical evidence of this interbasin flow, certainly from the east based on warm springs. That water looks like it's sourced from outside the basin. This is well withdrawal. This estimate's based on data that's collected by the USGS and made available in these water conditions of Utah reports through the years. So we compiled that, put it all together. We did work with the USGS to see if we could break out well withdrawal by the different conceptual zones to help our model. And they were able to provide breakouts for a certain time period up to, I think it was 2009 or 2010. And then beyond that, to actually fit with our water budget time period, we just assumed that the breakouts that we had record of, the percentages, we just extrapolated them through this period. Across all of Goshen, you get a total withdrawal of withdrawal of just under 20,000 acre feet a year. And then it's parsed out amongst the zones in this fashion. The lion's share of that well withdrawal looks like it's happening probably in that zone 2, the southwest part of the valley. Very little well withdrawal over in zone 3, and that's really it's all that wonderful Highline Canal water that's coming in. So you got surface water for ag. So the next thing we need to constrain is evapotranspiration, and that's both. So that's water that's consumed by natural plant communities, but then also irrigated agriculture. We start off with the natural plant communities. Those are basically limited to zone 3, which is on the east side of the valley here, a little bit east of Goshen. And to characterize that, we went through and carefully mapped the different wetland communities. You can see some pictures of them here. And then we use an automated technique based on satellite imagery and some of these details to come up with a map over here on the right that shows those different plant communities. And the reason we broke out the communities like this is that we have good pre-existing estimates of ET for these different communities. So these are, what we do is we came up with an area of the different communities, and then we've got an annual rate of evapotranspiration for a given community. And we sum that and we get a total volume of ET. You can see it's a big number down here, 17,000 acre feet a year. Next is crop ET. We tried a couple different methods with this. Some more modern quantitative methods of the metric or the SCE BOP method. They really didn't yield results that were consistent with the rest of our water budget. And I think that a lot of that has to do with our ability to average data across these techniques that require, these techniques are all based on satellite imagery. And so they're averaged through a different set of satellite images. And we just didn't have the right set, and or the averaging didn't quite work out. So we dumbed it down and we just went with the Division of Water Resources, their estimated of irrigated areas by crop type, and then applied standard rates for crop use from USU Extension. And you can see what kind of values we get. We get some big numbers here. Again, the biggest number is over on zone 3 on the east side of the valley. We also need to think about groundwater ET. I mentioned that in places where the groundwater is shallow, where it's within 20 feet or so of the land surface, there's a lot of plants. Greasewood can readily do this. Other little bushes and even some of the grasses, they can pull water up from that depth, so they can consume it. So we need to consider that in the budget. We do that here over in zone 3 by considering both natural ET and ag ET, and then we balance that against all the surface water that's available for this part of the basin. And then we get a number for groundwater ET. We basically take it as the residual of that subtraction. And it's fair to assume that the lion's share of groundwater ET, direct evapotranspiration of groundwater, occurs in this zone 3. And that's really because of the depth to water. This is the part of the valley where the water is close enough to the surface that plants can use it. These are some other calculations we needed to come up with our unconsumed, our estimates of unconsumed irrigation water. That's a little cut off on the right-hand side there. But we'll see a summary of that in the final slide. It's basically taken, unconsumed irrigation water is taken as a residual between the applied water, so that's well withdrawal, and then that Utah lake water divvied out across the zones, and then our estimate of crop ET. That makes sense. And so that does yield a little bit of water that goes back into the groundwater system in both those zones. That's leftover water that just wasn't consumed by the ag plants. And then in summary here, this is where we ended up with our budget. And it's broken out by basin, by these subzones here that carry down vertically, and then a total for all of Goshen over here on the right. You can see that we came up with numbers that are a little higher than the previous estimate back in 1995 for both discharge and recharge, but the differential between those numbers is pretty comparable. So it looks like discharge is just less than 3,000 acre feet a year greater than recharge in the basin. When we look at recharge, this is the number that really sticks out to me. You know, precip could be, maybe it's a quarter of recharge across Goshen Valley. Maybe up to a half of it really is interbasin flow, and primarily interbasin flow that would occur through Long Ridge or to a lesser degree through Musida Hills. When we look over the discharge part of the equation, we see that the lion's share of discharge here is well withdrawal. And that well withdrawal really is centered in that second zone in the southwest corner of the valley. And then this last line here is change in storage. So change in storage, this is a volume, this is taken as the residual between recharge and discharge. And when it's negative, it shows that we're pulling water out of storage in that system, basically, with the current setup. So down there in zone 2, it looks like it's maybe 2,700 acre feet a year are coming out of storage. The water coming out of storage, that's what causes the groundwater levels to decline sequentially through time. And a note about Utah Lake. So we also we were able to come up with the potential for there to be a little bit of discharge to Utah Lake, but it's not necessarily required when you consider error, and it may only be occurring or needed in conceptual zone 3 on the east side of the valley. So the other basins, there's just not water there to do that. Yeah, these are the final points. Basically, there's more discharge than recharge by about 3,000 acre feet. The lion's share of that discrepancy occurs in conceptual zone 2, that southwest part of the valley. And I think that is an important point too. There's the potential that there's very little, if any, groundwater discharge to Utah Lake at this stage out of Goshen. That's the end of my portion. I don't know if I'd be happy to take questions now. Yeah, it's up on this first slide, and I'm also happy to make this whole slide deck available. That's kind of why I put a bunch of text on it, so people can flip through it and hopefully get what's needed out of all the different slides. Let me go up to the starter slide here. It's a bit. Yeah, and currently it's available. If you just go to Utah Geological Survey publications, you type that in, you can type in Goshen in a little search field, it'll come up. And it'll come up with just this PDF, but then a bunch of supporting tables as well.
If water is coming somewhere else, where is it coming from?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's certainly coming from outside of the basin. I think that our best hint about where it's coming from are those recharge temperatures, because it looks like it recharged in a setting where the groundwater table is relatively cool, and you have to go a ways east, maybe up to near Santa Quin, east of Santa Quin, basically, before you would find comparable temperatures.
We're going to use the mic just so everyone can hear the question, especially for those who are participating online. Any questions?
Well, the other thing, if you come up with any questions going forward, please reach out to me. You can find me at our survey website too. I'm happy to talk about this stuff, either email or in person, to help explain things as best I can. Yeah, we intended to be. We'll be here the whole time if there's other things that come up.
So, I told me was completely.
Okay. So obviously this whole meeting was completely voluntary, and I'm not, this has no blame to anyone or anything, but obviously you say a lot of the groundwater and everything, the decline is in the southwest. Obviously that's a lot of church farm. And again, I'm not saying anything about anybody, but so if this is completely voluntary, does this information get spread to those people that are probably contributing more to the groundwater decline? Or at what point does all of this information go to probably the people that need to hear it more? And obviously we're not giving answers, and you guys aren't saying quit using water, but when it comes to looking at different resources for maybe making some change and making things happen. How can we get this information to those individuals that are
Yeah,
not voluntarily showing up?
That's probably a water rights question. So what we do at the Utah Geological Survey, everything we do is publicly available. That's our mission, is to put science out for the public, okay, to help make decisions about it.
So, so the whole point of this meeting is we did invite all of the water users, and I happen to know the church is here. But all of the water users are invited. And then this next part of the presentation that Chase is going to give, we're going to talk about the policy and then the steps forward and how we're going to get the information out even in more detail and from a water right perspective as well. So we'll get your question, I think, answered by the end. So, okay. Any other questions for Stefan? Okay, then we'll turn over to Chase.
All right. Well, Stefan, thank you for that. That was very helpful and informative. As Teresa said, my name is Chase McDonald. I am the regional engineer over the Utah Lake Jordan River region. And so looking at our agenda again, we just went through the UGS study. So now I'll talk to you about the current groundwater management plan. Again, this was the one implemented in 1995. So this, as the management plan is written now, Goshen Valley is closed to new appropriations, which means that all new withdrawals of groundwater have to be based on the acquisition of existing water rights within the area and the filing of a change application. Right now, that can be surface or groundwater rights, as the policy is written now. That last bullet there, the last study that was published in 1995, the state engineer looked at that at the time and determined to put these limits on water usage in the area through the groundwater management plan. So limited to an average of 18,000 acre feet per year on a 5-year moving average, and maximum withdrawal in any year shall not exceed 20,000 acre feet. Additionally, all proofs of change are required to submit a map delineating the land that's to be taken out of production. And it's also, those proofs are required to state the water rights annual withdrawal in acre feet per year. Currently, any wells with potential to divert 100 acre feet or more per year, as a condition of approval for that change application, they are required to report their water use annually to our water use program. And then at the end of the groundwater management plan, there is a paragraph in there that mentions that the state engineer can, through a public process, can update that groundwater management plan, which is what brings us here to present that UGS study and look at what, if any, changes we need to make. So the current conditions, again, this is from the USGS pumpage data from their website. As you can see, like I said, the 5-year moving average is not supposed to exceed 18,000 acre feet, and any year is not supposed to exceed 20,000. Clearly, we're over that mark, which is, again, why we're here. We need to make some changes. So the changes that we are proposing right now are that any change applications or exchanges that represent a new demand on the groundwater system will not be approved. Whereas right now, change applications from surface or underground sources may be considered. We would put an end to that. Anything that adds a new demand on the groundwater system will not be considered for approval. And that's that second point. Change applications proposing to divert water from underground sources will be critically reviewed. So even applications that are currently approved for for use out of a groundwater source will be critically reviewed. And then, like I said, currently the plan says that any well with the potential to divert over 100 acre feet will have to report to water use. We're considering changing that and lowering the bar on that so that any well that can divert more than a small amount of water as defined in Utah Code 73.3.5.6, which is basically a house, a quarter acre of irrigation, and up to 10 livestock. We're considering having anything above that mark report to water use so we can get a better idea of how much water is being used, get more data. So the next steps, so remember those are just proposed at this point. But the next steps, we want to get comments from the public. That's why we're holding this public meeting, put the information out there, present the study, and get comments from the community and the water users in the area. We will be doing a water right audit and inventory, looking at how much paper water is approved for use in this area, and how that fits into the new information that we have. And then we'll continue to review groundwater data. We talked a lot about inflow, interbasin flow, where the water in the area is coming from. You know, Stefan touched on the wetlands. We want to make sure that, or consider what impacts our plan will have on those wetlands. And obviously, one of the main concerns I'm sure that all the water users have is that decrease in static water levels. So we're going to look at all that. We're going to look at the UGS study, comments from you, and we really do appreciate and place a lot of importance on comments from the public. So please submit your comments to us. But that's the end of my little portion. Now, any questions and comments that you have now, we'd be happy to address. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the higher water users, that they have to record what they use. How is that policed, or is it just by word? You just take their word for it?
So as a condition of approval for change applications, that's placed, you know, this is approved based on these conditions, and that condition is placed in there. And then as they develop that, that change application, they'll submit proof of beneficial use, and we'll make sure that they've been reporting that data. Anything to add?
To that, so the reporting requirement, you want me to stand?
Yeah, sorry.
Switch over, Chase. The reporting requirement is to what's our water use reporting program. And so we do have an individual that will follow up with those that are supposed to report annually. And we can verify that information. We also will be looking to have meters installed if there's question, because we really do need to get the better data. And so we will be looking at that moving forward. So.
Two comments or questions. In zone 3, first of all, you're saying no new allocations of water. Zone 3 is actually positive recharge. I don't think that this is appropriate for zone 3 to restrict under those circumstances.
So two things. Number one, keep in mind that's just a new demand on the groundwater system. So
that's what I'm saying. If it's positive recharge, the budget is increasing, then you're restricting our use to 0 new wells.
And that's just a proposed change. I mean,
I think the proposal is irresponsible.
Okay.
So
And
one of the things that we're also looking at is This is kind of a funky setup. One of the things that we're also looking at is moving forward, do we manage the basin as a whole? Or like Stefan mentioned, we have the 3 areas that we identified, and they looked at that at our request to see if we could manage those areas independently. We haven't made that determination yet. But the comments that you're providing are helpful, and we're happy to take that under consideration.
Our
So,
understanding with this extensive research, and very well done, by the way, is these systems are independent of each other. Zone 3 especially from the west. Zone 3 in the east is independent from zone 1 and 2. And yet you're restricting us to the same rules.
and we'll look at appreciate the
Thank you.
comment and look at it for sure.
Yeah.
You had a second
I have
one.
a second question. I didn't really see very much research on the sources of current creek water, which is really important in this valley. There is enormous amount of water use, increasingly above this water source, like in Mona and Nephi. And do we have those same restrictions? Do we have any responsibility to what's going on up there, to what water comes down Current Creek? Seems to me this needs to be addressed.
So it is, and we just had a public meeting for the Joab Valley on, what date was that? 12th of December. You can find that information on our website, also on the UGS website. So we did have that public meeting. You can give us your contact, and when we do another public meeting there, you're welcome to attend. So we are doing the exact same work in that area as well.
Just maybe a couple of questions. I'm the mayor of Goshen. So I'm just trying to understand, you have all these, just for one example, town of Goshen has a well that we honestly don't turn on that much at all. I mean, we do most of our water from our spring that services our community. So as you're looking at the water usage, do you equate the potential usage that the town maybe is going to need to use that water someday? And is there any priority given to a municipality in those cases? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, I think it makes sense. So really what this data is looking at is just current pumping and what is occurring there. You as a municipality do have some statutory protections, but if we regulate by priority, it's simply regulation by priority. The junior users get cut off, and this more senior users. So I'm not sure exactly where that Goshen priority falls. We did do a list, and when we did the first meeting back in 2014, and that is on our website as well, that you can see a listing by priority, all of the water rights that are in this basin. And so if you go to our website for this page, you can see that. So you could look that up.
Okay, thank you. But currently I don't see any immediate need for that. We're actually trying to use our spring water more wisely and store it better and transport it better and things like that. But just curious what the future may bring, because currently we use it very, very little at all. So thank you.
Water audit.
So I've gone through since early 80s, one of the driest drought times that we've had in this area for years and years. So it's common sense, right? That if we're not getting the snowpack and the moisture, that we may not be recharging to a certain extent, to the extent that we would. How much consideration in all of this has gone into that fact?
Yeah, so the years of the study were what, Stefan? 2017 to 2008 to 2017. Yeah. Stefan, do you want to?
Oh, yeah.
So the period of the water budget for our estimates was 2008 to 2017, I believe. That represents, I mean, that's a cross section of this larger drought period, you know, so it's probably maybe it doesn't represent the driest years or the few wettest years, but I think it's a pretty good cross section of the water budget in the current climate setup.
And maybe just another point, you know, Chase showed the pumping that the USGS had estimated in that chart. And you can see, I think you can definitely see the last 3 years that have been exceptionally dry and relying on that groundwater. So, you know, the pumping really increased. You know, 2020 was jumped up to 30,000. So I think, did that answer your question? I mean, it's more information that we just need to look at. Right now, where we are is the existing adopted management plan, and the limits in that plan are greatly exceeded. But we're hoping if we can get better data, better understanding of the water rights, the supplemental nature of those water rights, you know, possibly is somebody using the water right more than it's approved for, and then we can cut those back if they're not approved for those full amounts. And then we're hoping to see where that then we end up. And then we'll come back with that information as well. So, question.
Do you have a chart that would go alongside that would show the snow impact in relation to that discharge? Because you see 17 versus 19, and then you come up to 21. If there was on the side a graph that showed how much snowfall, that would give a comparison.
Sure.
I mean, those are things that we look at. Yeah. And I mean, Teresa mentioned that, you know, in 2020, it was an exceptionally dry year. So there was more pumping. So there is some correlation there. That's something that we'll consider as well.
Thanks, Blake. I like to give a scenario and then a question with that scenario. Let's say you have a groundwater to groundwater change application where the water right originated in this Goshen Valley, but they're just changing the point of diversion. Is there any language, any proposed language that covers that situation?
We haven't even come up with proposed language yet. And I mean, all we have so far is that'll be critically reviewed. And obviously, you know, to some of the points we've made earlier, we're considering looking at would it make sense to look at different regions, and we're kind of everything's on the table at this point. We're just trying to gather more information. We just got a lot of information from the UTS. We're looking for more information from the water users. We have more work to do on our end, and you know, so I don't have a specific answer for that, but we're looking into it, and that's stuff we consider.
Thank you.
So less than 100 acre feet per year. And in your proposed changes, it's going to go down like to a household with 10 dogs. And to be needed, will that existing be retroactive to all the smaller water users less than 100 acre feet, and that meter be retroactive?
If we adopt that in a new groundwater management plan, then yes. And so that's part of the comments that you can help provide as well. So maybe, and I just want to kind of just a couple takeaways from this, that why we scheduled this meeting. Well, we have the study, the new information from that good time frame. I guess I would say a good estimate there. But as we look at current withdrawals or pumping, it is exceeding the groundwater management plan now. And we feel that it's fair and necessary to let you know what is occurring and the information that we have. We are committed to work with you. You're going to see Chase and Jacob contacting you and actually looking at your water rights, making sure that we have the best information that we need. But we needed to bring this information so that we're all on the same page as to the data that we're seeing. We're definitely exceeding what the management plan allows as far as withdrawals right now. So we need to share that with you and let you know that. So any other questions? We'll be here for a little bit longer. We can hang out if you have specific questions that you want to just ask us. We're happy to wait for a few minutes after the meeting if you want to do that. Or if there's more, you have another question up front here? Okay.
I'm sorry, just one more.
Sure.
In a nutshell, what is the data on the recharge to the Burston ponds as opposed to as from the increased use in Nephi and Mona? Since you've already got that research done, and I haven't seen it addressed, but maybe I didn't, maybe I missed it.
Yeah, and I don't know, Hugh, is that something you could give just a quick summary, or is that going to take too much time? I mean, you didn't bring any of your information with you. Okay, so he's the primary, you were primary on that study. So maybe even Hugh could get your contact, or you could get Hugh's contact. Yeah. And then you can follow up with him directly on that. We didn't bring any of the Nephi information with us. We did all of Juab Valley, which goes all the way down to Chicken Creek and Levan. So the public meeting we had was that entire area, but we're happy to get that.
If this is only proposals, how do we protest proposals?
Provide us comment. So you can submit that, send it to our email address. We've got it right here, and send it right there. We definitely need the comments. So it's not necessarily a protest point, but we want your comments. We want to hear from you. And this will be on our website too, so in case you don't have this contact, or write it down. So another question back there. I could stand and lean on here.
Who is going to make the decision, and how many people are in agriculture who are going to make the decision on your party?
How many of us are active farmers?
Right.
Good question. So this is really, again, why we need your comment. You are the folks that are here using the water and know this valley. You live here. And so we do need your input. And let me just explain the process that we will do. We're not just going to come out here and say this is going to be the policy. We'll take these comments this summer. We're going to work with the individual water rights, get some additional data, look at it, and then we'll come back probably the end of summer, do a similar meeting to provide that information to you. If we're going to change the policy, which we haven't determined exactly if we're going to change it yet. If we're going to change it, we will give so many days for comment. We go through the public process again. If we need to have another meeting, we will. And then there is opportunity to ask for reconsideration of that decision. And then if you don't agree with the implementation of the policy, there is a district court option that can happen. But this is going to be a public process with you.
Well, we all know how regulations start and they never come off. And 5 years down the road, we might be flooded in Goshen Valley. Then what will you do? Not allow us to have wells?
Yeah. So the current policy right now was adopted in '95, and that's what we shared with you with those limits. So that is the current adopted policy. So do we need to look at what the recharge is, these estimates that they've provided? Do we need to go higher than the limits that we have right now in existing policy, which is the 18,000 on the average of over 5 years or 1 year of 20. Can we go higher or do we need to go lower? But those are the things we need to look at. But we have existing policy right now since 95. Oh, you walked right by.
Oh, did you know what? Yeah.
Sorry. More of just a comment than a question. I just from my previous question, I guess just, since we're bringing up like the JUAB and everything else, since everything works downstream, and I know that, groundwater and irrigation has been an argument between JUAB and the Goshen Valley since it was settled. I guess it'd just be my insight to just include at least JUAB and the Goshen Valley all together when you guys are making these proposals, because I know it'd be pretty easy for entities like Young Living or the tomato plant to just not bat an eye at it, and they irrigate, and that doesn't do anything for more reservoir, and then so we can't get that recharge at least to the groundwater down the road. So I guess just to reiterate, getting that information to those bigger entities so that they have a little bit more push to make those changes besides us that, we've got 20 water shares or 2 or 3 wells where they're out there pumping hundreds and hundreds of acres throughout the summer. So I guess that'd be my comment, just to kind of push the bigger entities as well as us that kind of see more consequences to these proposals.
Yeah, and we're definitely aware of that unique relationship with Mona Reservoir and the users here. So again, follow the others' policies as well and make sure that we have your contact for that. Okay. Any other specific questions? Okay. Truly, we appreciate the public coming and talking to us. We know we can't make decisions just in our office. We have to come and speak with the folks within the communities. So this is what we're doing with these meetings. And I ask, please communicate to us and provide those comments. It doesn't help if you don't comment, then we may miss something. So participate in the process and help us understand, and we'll work together and see what we can come up with based on this data. One more question?
Will there be a final meeting if people aren't on the internet and aren't commenting or don't know about it? Will there be a final meeting or two before final decisions are made so that people can come together and hear what you're going to do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll probably get to know each other over a few more meetings here. So definitely.
What is your timeline?
So what I've tasked these guys with is that we would come back probably around the end of the summer with some additional information based on the water right audits that we will be doing. And then we're also going to look at the information that the UGS, the study that they did. We haven't had it that long either. And so we're going to take a closer look at that and how it may relate to policies. So we'll definitely bring all of that back. But I'm anticipating you'll see us back at the end of the summer. But there won't be like, this is going to be the policy at that end of the summer. We're just going to bring you that additional information. So okay, we'll be here for a few more minutes, so please approach us. We've got a few folks here. Happy to answer the specific questions you have. And thank you. Truly, we appreciate it.